Hi everyone. Today, what we're going to try and cover, we're going to touch on the environment for funds and managers, obviously on the compliance regulatory perspective. Also the requirements themselves, I'll touch upon those, but then we get in some detail as far as the role of the compliance officer and the compliance function within these specific rules. And then we'll touch upon two quite important aspects to close off, which is the general compliance culture required within funds and fund managers, as well as ultimately touching upon the compliance monitoring to wrap it all up. To kick into it, just a bit about Zodiac. We're a regulatory-based entity servicing solely asset managers, funds and fund managers. We offer various services, as pointed out here. We've been in the space since 2008, and I've personally been in the space since 2004. And we focus, again, our core is regulatory compliance. To kick into it straight away, from an environment perspective, we all know this, or most of us know this, but it's good to remember that ultimately the Investment Services Act is the principal act around all the regulations and where all the rules stem from. But there are also EU-specific rules. Some of them are transposed, the directives, and some of them are direct law, the regulation, and we'll touch upon that in a second. And then there's also other jurisdictions which we consider, predominantly the US, to make sure, see what the global front is doing, because as we know, the asset managers are global when they come here as well. I mentioned the directives which are already being transposed, which again, everybody probably has already heard them, the MiFIDs, UCITS 4, CRD, and the AML requirements. And as James pointed out, the AIFM, which is coming into play within a year, and it's important that, like everything else, especially because there's rumors that the AIFM might be a regulation, not a directive, which means that might be faster put in place. And the reason is to be consistent across all jurisdictions, and so there won't be any arbitrage in regulation. But that's coming into place in a year, so people need to start getting very aware of what's happening, together with also UCITS 5. Just really quickly touch upon the different rules that are out there, because what we're trying to do here today is, James just mentioned as far as setting up a fund or a fund manager, and then what happens once they're licensed. You know, does everything stop? Absolutely not, obviously. One needs to make sure there's a compliance outfit or a compliance function to facilitate ongoing matters and making sure the companies essentially stay compliant. But we're going to talk about schemes, funds, and then later on we're going to talk about managers. From a funds perspective, there are different types of professional funds, so the PIFs as we know them, and that's basically just difference on the experience of the investors, but it's quite important, especially what we've been reading in the news. And there's retail funds, which are the UCITS fund or the non-UCITS funds. As far as the regulatory compliance requirements specific for funds, in a nutshell, transparency is always obviously on everybody's aim, but essentially the OM, the offering memorandum, or the prospectus as we know it, has to include all the main information that the investor would need at time of investing. And it's important that the promoters of the funds, generally the fund managers, make sure that they explain everything that they need to explain. For example, in the UCITS now I have the KID, which is a short summary of everything, but the investor has to be aware. Whether they read it or not, whether the investor reads it or not, is really the investor's requirement, but ultimately if something goes wrong, the board of directors of the fund will be responsible. So it's important that information is properly passed on. Specific requirements for funds, obviously the regulatory requirements is more on managers than the funds. When we're talking PIFs, UCITS has more. But the compliance officer would need to prepare a compliance report every 6 months, predominantly around confirming that there are or there aren't any breaches and how those breaches were dealt with, mainly around the main pertinent information around in the offering memorandum, obviously talking about investment objectives, policies and all. Any breaches themselves, depending on how important they are or how big the breach is itself, may need to be communicated to the board and ultimately also to the MFSA, so it's important to remember that. And as I mentioned, and as James mentioned as well, the UCITS fund themselves have specific limitations other than what the PIF has. Truly, it's also very important here, just in case anybody here sits as board members on UCITS funds, that the onus is on the fund to make sure that the limitations are adhered to. The manager is delegated and also has to ensure they have proper risk management processes in place. But the fund board needs to confirm that the manager is able and capable and on an ongoing basis reports back to the board of the fund to make sure they are doing their duty properly. So it's not enough just to say the managers doing it, they're in the UK, they know what they're doing. You have to make sure that you're doing your diligence. There are other requirements from a fund. We all know this probably. It's annual audited accounts and semi-annual non-audited accounts due to both the investors and MFSA. An important one, obviously, as we've been reading lately in the news, the investor declaration for PIFs is very important. We have to ensure that the investor who claims he has the experience does have the experience. It will be interesting to see how this develops in the future and whose onus it's going to be to make sure they are signing in the right line. Other than PIFs, as we mentioned, and funds in general, then we're talking about managers. And again, just to put in perspective, there are various rules. There's Part B1, which is general managers, but it also includes investment advisors, and there are a few here today. And then Part B2, which is predominantly for UCITS managers. But there are also appendices and guidance notes from MFSA on their website. A couple of important ones to mention are risk management and RMI. That's going to be even more important, as James alluded to, come AIFM. So whereas today you can get certain derogations, as I'll mention in a minute, in come AIFM, that might not be the case anymore. And similarly, there's a remuneration policy. So depending on the structure you have in Malta, and if the individuals are trading and making money and having salaries, you may need a remuneration policy. So this is quite hot in the UK or where the managers really stem. So it will become an important matter for Malta too. Financial capital requirements is obviously always important, the minimum of 125, as James mentions. There's also appendix on penalties. And that's good to keep in mind. The penalty is not because there is a penalty, we all know that, but one can look at the different types of breaches to try and get a grasp around how important that breach is to the MFSA. So ultimately, in life, everything is a risk-based decision, and one should be in line with the law. But if you are not in line with law because of something out of your reach or out of your control, you could try and get a bit of an understanding of those breaches by the penalties that might be in place. And lastly, on UCITS again, there's Appendix 11, which is very detailed and covers the risk management processes and how the manager should manage the risk management process around the limitations for UCITS. It's quite detailed and it goes through all the steps one by one. The rules themselves, so Part B1, Part B2, essentially are split up in various sections. General requirements, which we'll touch upon. Conduct of business, we'll touch upon a few. Outsourcing, which James touched upon, but I will touch upon a bit. And then others, which I'm not going to discuss today, but disclosure requirements and capital requirements. The general requirements include proper structure. So it's not enough to get your license, and a lot of managers might push to get the license and say yes to everything. And then we come in, the compliance, and say, okay, now that you've said that, now let's make sure we put it into place. So there's the requirements on a general perspective through the application for setting up compliance, risk, if it's not exempted, the board, investment committee. There may also be independent risk management functions. If relevant, you can generally get a derogation for these. Policies and requirements, and general controls in place from an outsourcing and from all angles, so the manager can prove that they are carrying out their functions properly, as well as the capital requirements to make sure that you are in line with capital requirements on a day-to-day basis, not on a quarterly basis, in line with the submission to the MFSA.